Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to another video on my channel. My name is Josh Fan of ShowMeFootball.com and ArrowheadAddict.com, and we are continuing our breakdown and our coverage of the Kansas City Chiefs after their collapse against the Cincinnati Bengals in the AFC Championship game. And there's a topic I have really wanted to talk about over the last couple days that I've noticed a lot on social media, just in Chiefs Twitter spheres and stuff like that. If you were to make a Chiefs kind of blame pie for why they lost that game, like divide up all the factors why they lost and the impact of each one, how big each one was. So, like, for example, if you made a blame pie, right? The biggest slice would go to Patrick Mahomes, I feel like. A lot of people would say Patrick Mahomes was the biggest reason they lost that game. But he wasn't the only one, which is why there's a pie. I think there's some other smaller slices that would go to other things, like Andy Reid and the play calling. But I think the second biggest slice would have to go to the Chiefs' pass rush. I really felt like the pass rush let this team down. On paper, the Kansas City Chiefs defensive line should have dominated the Bengals' offensive line. They should have dominated. And it's not even because the Chiefs defensive line is one of the elite groups in the entire league, but it's because the Bengals offensive line is so bad. They gave up the most sacks in the entire league this season, and they had given up 9 sacks against the Tennessee Titans in the game prior to the Kansas City Chiefs. And the Chiefs defensive line even wreaked havoc in the Week 17 game against the Bengals in the regular season. Yet, on the biggest stage, and the moment they needed the pass rush to step up the most, the Chiefs' pass rush failed. They could only muster 1 sack against Joe Burrow, and I think it's fair to argue that if they had brought him down just a couple more times, that game would have been different, and the defensive performance, we would think more fondly of it. But instead, the Chiefs lost, and again, I think the pass rush was a big reason why. They could not get to Joe Burrow, and it was a problem that happened all year long, really. I mean, guys, how many times did this Chiefs defensive line, before and after Melvin Ingram, really, how many times did they go up against a much lesser opponent on paper, and we said, oh yeah, the Chiefs defensive line, they are going to wreak havoc in this game, or they should, and they just didn't. Like, they just totally underwhelmed. It has happened way too many times, and it happened again against the Bengals. And I think this game, what happened in it, is going to kickstart a entire overhaul of the defensive line for the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, I think the Chiefs are really going... I think this is going to be one of their best off seasons yet, since Brett Veach has been here. And that's mainly because this year they don't have any major holes. Like, they have weaknesses, they have holes. Maybe people would disagree and they would say they're still major holes. But, like, it's not to the degree of, like, the offensive line last off season. Like, obviously that was priority number 1. And then before that, it was the defense. The defense was so bad. The defense was priority number 1. Shoring them up was always going to be Brett Veach's first thing on the to-do list. But this year, I kind of feel like there's not that one thing weighing this team down, but there's still weaknesses that need to be addressed. And, of course, one of those is defensive line. But, the offensive line, they got their overhaul last year. I don't think an overhaul for the defensive line this year would be, as big or as extravagant as the one to the offensive line. But you know what? The offensive line had their turn, and now it's the defensive line's turn. Now they are going to get the overhaul that they need. They simply cannot go into next year with Chris Jones, Frank Clark, and Melvin Ingram or another veteran. It's just not enough. Like, it's time to get some fresh talent on this team. A lot of Chiefs fans already have, they're already very opinionated on who should stay and who should go on this defensive line. I've seen some hot takes already. I'm going to kind of run down their situation on the defensive line and who I think should stay or go, or what I think the Chiefs are kind of going to do. But a lot of people have come to their conclusion. But I think we can all agree that there needs to be some big changes. And Brett Veach said in his press conference earlier today there's going to be some tough decisions to make on that defensive line. Well, tough depending on how you look at it. But let's kind of go over things, because after this Bengals game, people have been very opinionated. So first there's Frank Clark. And Frank Clark had a miserable performance against the Bengals. He missed a bunch of tackles. He recorded 1 pressure and 34 pass rushing snaps, 0 sacks, 0 QB hits. The whole playoff Frank Clark thing was a myth. That label that he earned from Chiefs fans has quietly faded since 2019. And to be quite honest, I feel like his 2019 postseason run was overrated for a lot of reasons that I've said before. I'm not going to get into that whole thing again. Point is, I think Frank Clark's time in Kansas City is done. Number one, because he's not worth the cap hit. And two, like, he just hasn't been great. Like I said, he's not worth the cap hit. His cap hit combined with the fact that he's not producing is why he's going to get cut, and the Chiefs are going to move on there. And then there's Chris Jones. Now, I've seen people all of a sudden turn on Chris Jones, and there's been people who have turned on Chris Jones before, because there's this stat floating around now that he has 0 sacks in 11 career playoff games. And while the stat is discouraging, and I understand why people are upset with Jones, and that sack that he had on Burrow that Burrow ended up escaping, like, you got to have that, and it sucks. But Chris Jones was still the top pressure getter in that game. He's been a game wrecker in the postseason. Like, a lot of people rave about Frank Clark's 2019 postseason sacks, like the one in the Super Bowl. The reason he got that sack in the Super Bowl was because Chris Jones pushed the pocket. Chris Jones was also a game wrecker against the Tennessee Titans during that 2019 Super Bowl run. He had a clutch sack against Devin Singletary against the Bills in the divisional round this year. Like, Chris Jones has had big plays in the postseason. Heck, he had a couple passes batted down late in the fourth quarter of Super Bowl 54 against the San Francisco 49ers. If you're just factoring in sacks in your evaluation of these Chiefs defensive linemen, then yeah, you might come away thinking that Jones is a no-show in the playoffs. But if you're looking at QB hits, pressures, the ability to push the pocket, Chris Jones is this team's best defensive lineman. He's their best pass rusher. And this notion that the Chiefs have to move on from Chris Jones, God, I keep saying Frank Clark. I keep wanting to say Frank Clark. But this notion that they have to move on from Chris Jones is ridiculous. Guys, there is no scenario, and I mean no scenario, where the Chiefs pass rush is better next year than it was this year if you trade Chris Jones or if you get rid of Chris Jones. That is stupid. That is ridiculous. I understand why people are unsatisfied with Chris Jones, but here's the thing. He's an interior defensive lineman. He's a defensive tackle. His job is to eat up double teams, eat up blocks, push the pocket, and make things easier for the defensive ends. But the Chiefs have failed Chris Jones at the edge positions because the best they've given to him, this year was Melvin Ingram. Like, Melvin Ingram was their best edge defender, and he was a 32-year-old that they acquired for a 6th-round pick. Like, that's simply not good enough. You look back at what Chris Jones did in his career year where he had 15 sacks in 2018, look who was on the edges that year. Dee Ford and Justin Houston. Those guys were players that were double teamed, teams were afraid of, they had to account for, and it allowed Chris Jones to play more freely, and he played looser, and he just doesn't have that same luxury now because he's like the guy on the defensive line. Teams double team him constantly. They're not afraid of Frank Clark. Melvin Ingram, again, is a nice piece, but he's 32 years old. He should not be your best edge defender on a really good defense. The Chiefs simply rely on Chris Jones too much to get all of their pass rush. Heck, they were so desperate at one point that they tried to move Chris Jones out to edge. Don't you guys remember that? They need to get Chris Jones help. Chris Jones doesn't have good enough help right now. I already kind of went over Melvin Ingram when talking about Chris Jones. Like, Melvin Ingram, I would like the Chiefs to bring him back. I think he was really good for this team. But you still need a youth and talent injection on this defensive line, likely through the draft. And then there's free agency. I think when they move on from Clark, they're going to move on from Clark and they're going to save money. And they need to go out and they need to get a veteran as well and draft a guy. I think you have to go both ways. And I'd look at guys like Chandler Jones maybe on a veteran, kind of 1 or 2 year deal. Zadarius Smith, I think, is going to be a free agent. I think he has a player option with the Packers. Maybe you could look into him. Emmanuel Ogbah, former Kansas City Chief. I think they made a mistake in letting him go. You could look to bring him back. I'm not sure how likely that one would be. But point is, I think you need to bring in a veteran and a young guy and Melvin Ingram. This defensive line needs more. It just needs a lot more. Jaron Reed, I think he wasn't really all that impressive. He was definitely not what the Chiefs sold him as. I think you move on from him. Tershawn Morton probably takes his snaps. And I like what the Chiefs have in some of these younger depth guys like Mike Dana, Tershawn Morton, Colin Saunders. But they, before the season started, they baited us all into thinking, these guys are going to step up and they're really going to help the Chiefs pass rush. And they're just simply not that guy. They're good depth pieces. They're good 3s and 4s and 5s. But the Chiefs tried to make them number 2. Mike Dana was starting for this team when Frank Clark was out and Chris Jones was playing some of his snaps at defensive end. That's not good enough. It's just not. Alex Okafor, you have to move on from him. He doesn't give much to this team anymore. And you need to hope that Joshua Kando develops and maybe can take some of his snaps. But, the fact of the matter is the Chiefs' pass rush needs to look a lot different, and I think Brett Veach knows that. And he's going to have the resources. The Chiefs are going to have money to spend. They have a bunch of picks in this upcoming draft. They have a couple third-rounders. They got a first-rounder. They got a second-rounder. And I expect this defensive line to look a lot different by next year. I think it's been a weakness for a while now. And I think a lot of that had to do with the underperformance of Frank Clark. They spent a lot of money on Frank Clark thinking he would be this franchise pass rusher, and he's just been anything but that. I mean, if he was what his contract says, then the Chiefs wouldn't have to be moving on from him this offseason, but unfortunately they have to because he just hasn't been great. And it sucks because a lot of the blame that should be going to him is going to other guys like Chris Jones when it's just not his fault. But yeah, I kind of wanted to go on a little bit of a rant because I've noticed more Chris Jones disrespect start to come out, and it's not on Chris Jones. It's not all on Chris Jones. Yes, he should have sacked Burrow on that one play, but he still had the most pressures in that game. He was top 3 in pressures among all players who played on championship weekend. He does not deserve the slander that he's getting. And I repeat one more time, there is no scenario in which the Chiefs trade Chris Jones and have a better pass rush next season than they had this season. It's just not. It's not going to happen. That's stupid. Come on. But yeah, that's all I got for this video. I think what happened in the AFC Championship is going to kickstart huge changes in this defensive line starting this offseason. Free agency is only 6 weeks away. I'm surprised it's already that close. But it's the offseason now, man. Talks are going to start heating up. You're going to see more free agency videos on my page coming up soon. Some mock drafts. I'm hoping to do a mock draft actually tomorrow with Hydra, and we can get an early look at some prospects and get some of his thoughts as well as mine. But yeah, guys, stay tuned. And if you're still watching this, make sure you like, share, and subscribe so more Chiefs fans can find this. And make sure you check out my work on showmefootball.com and arrowheadaddict.com. But all that being said, I will see you guys in the next one.